Claude responded, I walked out of my office. I walked out of my office. That is the detail I keep returning to when I replay that morning. Not the way my sister's face went pale when the receptionist said my name, not the way her hand trembled against the counter. What I keep returning to is the fact that I was the one who walked toward her calmly, in my white coat, with my department badge and my 22 years of choices hanging from my chest like a second spine, and that I did it on purpose. I did not send a nurse. I did not ask my assistant, Priya Chandrasekaran, to intercept her in the lobby. I walked out of my own office, down the corridor of the Whitmore Center for Internal Medicine at Carver University Hospital, past the wall where my board certification and department commendation plaques hang in a row, and I went to meet my sister myself. My name is Dr. Renata Voss. I am 51 years old. I am the department head of internal medicine at Carver University Hospital in Hartford, Connecticut. I have held that title for 4 years. I held the title of senior attending physician in the same department for 6 years before that. I say these things not to impress you. I say them because for a very long time, the only person in my family who believed I would hold any title at all was me, and even I had moments of doubt so complete that I had to keep a folded piece of paper in my wallet just to remember why I was still trying. My sister's name is Dorothea. Dorothea Voskremer. She is 3 years older than I am. She is the one who told me, on a Sunday afternoon in September of 2003, with a cup of tea cooling between her hands, that I would never survive medical training. She said it the way people say things they believe are obvious, not with cruelty exactly, with the particular confidence of someone delivering a fact. She arrived at my hospital that morning by appointment. She did not know it was my hospital. She did not know the department head she had been referred to was me. She looked at the directory on the wall of the lobby, and she saw my name on a placard no bigger than a paperback book, and apparently she stood in front of it long enough that the front desk receptionist, a young man named Tomas Reyes, came around from behind his station to ask if she needed help. He told me later that she had gone white, that she kept pointing at the placard and not saying anything. I had recognized her chart number before any of that happened. It came across my desk as a referral from a physician in the suburbs, Dr. Anselm Wyrick of Millbrook Family Practice, and when I saw the patient name I sat very still for approximately 40 seconds. Then I picked up my pen, initialed the intake form, and asked Priya to schedule the consultation. I did not tell Priya why I initialed it myself instead of routing it to one of my attendings. I just did it. And then I waited. Hello, everyone. Before I continue, if you have ever been told you would never amount to anything by someone who should have believed in you, leave a comment below. I want to hear your story, I mean that. Because what I am about to tell you took me the better part of 2 decades to live through, and I have never told all of it in one place before. Not to a friend, not to a colleague, not even to my therapist, Dr. Simonich Terberg, who has sat with me through more of this story than anyone else alive. I am telling it now because the morning my sister walked into my hospital, something finished. Something that started in a kitchen in Bridgeport, Connecticut, in the autumn of 2003 finally arrived at its end, and I think I owe it to myself, and maybe to you, to say the whole thing out loud. To understand why that morning meant what it did, I have to take you back. 22 years back. To a version of myself who was 29 years old, who had just been accepted to a post-baccalaureate pre-medical program, and who made the mistake of telling her family about it at dinner. I was 29 when I applied to the Hartley Post-Baccalaureate Pre-Medical Program at Northeastern Connecticut University. I was working as a medical transcriptionist at Bridgeport General Hospital at the time, a job I had taken at 23 because it kept me close to medicine while I paid down my undergraduate loans, and a job I had stayed in because it turned out I was extraordinarily good at it, good enough that the chief of medicine, Dr. Franklin Osai, had personally requested that I be assigned to his department 3 years running. I understood what the physicians were saying. I understood the records, the terminology, the diagnostic language. I understood it the way you understand something you have always known. I had been quietly taking prerequisite courses at Northeastern Connecticut in the evenings for 2 years before I applied to the pre-med program. Biology, organic chemistry, physics. I paid for them myself, one course at a time, on a transcriptionist's salary, because my family had made it clear, without ever sitting me down to say it explicitly, that my educational ambitions were my own problem. My father had contributed to my undergraduate degree under significant pressure from my mother, who died when I was 26, and after that the financial understanding in the family was that Dorothea, who had a stable job in insurance and a husband with a decent income, was the responsible child, and that I, who had a series of ambitions my father called impractical, was on my own. The dinner where I announced my acceptance was in September of 2003. It was a Sunday. My father, Heinz Voss, made roast chicken. My aunt, Margarethe Voss, my father's sister, was there as she was most Sundays. Dorothea and her husband, Karl Kremer, were there. I waited until we had finished eating and I said that I had something to share. I told them I had been accepted to the Hartley pre-medical program, that I planned to complete my prerequisites, apply to medical school, and become a physician. There was a silence that lasted long enough for me to hear the refrigerator running in the kitchen. Then Dorothea said, "Renata, you are 29 years old." I said I was aware of that. She said, "Medical school is 4 years. Residency is at minimum 3 more. You would be 36 before you were even licensed, assuming you passed everything on the first attempt." She said this last part carefully, as if she did not want to be cruel but felt that accuracy required it. I said that I had done the math. My father did not say anything for a long time. Then he said, "Your mother would have wanted you to be practical." My Aunt Margarethe looked at the table. Karl Kremer cleared his throat and said that the pre-med program was expensive and asked how I planned to pay for it. I said I had savings and I was looking into loans. Dorothea put down her fork and said, and I remember this precisely, the exact phrasing, because I have replayed it enough times to have worn grooves in the memory. She said, "You would never survive medical training, Renata. You know that, right? It is not a question of intelligence, it is a question of resilience. Medical training breaks people who are built for it. You are not built for it." She picked up her fork again. "I am saying this because I love you." My father nodded. That was the worst part. He nodded as though she had said something careful and generous. I did not argue. I had learned, by 29, that arguing with Dorothea was like arguing with a wall that had the ability to quote you back to yourself. I sat through the rest of the dinner and helped clear the table and drove home to my apartment on Fulton Street and sat on the edge of my bed for a long time. Then I got up, found a notepad, and wrote down the name of the Hartley program. I wrote down the name of the MCAT prep course I had been researching. I wrote down the name of the student loan officer at the program who had told me about a partial scholarship for non-traditional applicants. I folded the paper into quarters and put it in my wallet. I kept it there for 6 years. What I did not tell anyone that night, what I did not tell anyone for a very long time, was that the program's partial scholarship would cover 40% of my tuition if I maintained a certain GPA, and that the remaining cost, approximately $28,400 over 2 years, I had already begun to plan for. I had been contributing to a small investment account since I was 24, advised by a financial advisor at a local firm named Gerald Okonkwo of Stratford Wealth Partners, who had told me to treat my medical school fund the way other people treated a college fund, incrementally, quietly, over years. I was not starting from nothing. I was starting from somewhere my family could not see. The one thing I could not plan for was what my Aunt Margarethe did the following spring. What she did, she never told me she was doing. She told me afterward, years afterward, and by then it had already shaped everything. My first MCAT attempt, in the spring of 2004, was a disaster. I do not use that word loosely. I had studied for 8 months while working full-time as a transcriptionist. I had taken the Kaplan prep course on weekends. I had read every piece of advice I could find from non-traditional applicants. I sat down in the testing center on a Tuesday morning in March with 2 sharpened pencils and 6 years of accumulated intention, and I scored a 497. A 497 on a 528-point scale. A score that, at the time, would not get me a serious look from any allopathic medical school in the country. I drove home from the testing center, and I parked in front of my apartment building, and I did not go inside for approximately 40 minutes. I need you to understand what that felt like in the context of Dorothea's voice in my head, because her voice was there. It is always there when you fail at the thing someone told you would fail at. The failure feels like a confirmation rather than a setback. It feels like the world is agreeing with them. I went inside, I made coffee. I sat at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and I wrote down, very carefully and very specifically, what I had done wrong. Not what life had done to me, what I had done. I had studied the content. I had not studied the test. I had not understood the logic structure of the MCAT's reasoning sections. I had treated it like a knowledge exam when it was, in significant part, a reasoning exam. I wrote this down in 3 numbered points. Then I wrote down what I was going to do differently. I called the Hartley admissions office the next morning and spoke with a woman named Patricia Nguyen, who was the academic coordinator for the pre-med program. I told her my score and I asked her what she recommended. She did not flinch. She said, "Take it again in September. Use the next 6 months to do practice tests, not content review. You know the content, you need to learn the test." Then she said, "A lot of people score in the low 500s on their second attempt after a 497. You need a 509 to be competitive. Work toward a 510. I scored a 511 in September of 2004. I sat in the parking lot of the testing center again. This time, I stayed in the car because I was shaking too hard to drive, and I did not want to go anywhere until I could do it steadily. Patricia Nguyen called me 3 days after my scores were released. She said, "I told you so." I started crying and had to put the phone down for a moment. I applied to medical school in the fall of 2004. I was accepted to Carver University School of Medicine in the spring of 2005. Full acceptance, not waitlisted. I did not tell my father until the day before orientation. I told him over the phone. He said, "Well," then a silence. "Then I suppose you know what you are doing." He did not say he was proud of me. He did not say congratulations. He said, "I suppose you know what you are doing," and that sentence has more complicated geography in my memory than almost anything else I can name. I did not tell Dorothy at all. I let her find out through my father. She called me 2 days later and said, "Dad tells me you are doing this after all." Not congratulations. Not I was wrong. She said, "I hope you have a plan for the health insurance coverage situation. Medical students often lose their employer coverage when they leave their jobs, and it's more complicated than people expect." She said this as though she were being helpful. I said I was aware of the insurance policy landscape and had already enrolled in the student health plan. She said, "Good." I hung up the phone and wrote 4 words on the legal pad I still kept beside my bed. I do not need to tell you what those 4 words were. You can probably guess. What I did need, and did not yet have, was the $28,400 remaining in program fees after my partial scholarship. I had $19,600 in my investment account. I had taken out the maximum available in federal student loans. I was $8,800 short, and I had 12 days until my enrollment deposit was due. It was Gerald Okonkwo who suggested I look into the supplemental loan programs offered through the Carver University Financial Aid Office, specifically for non-traditional students over 27. I called the Financial Aid Office at 7 o'clock in the morning on a Thursday. I spoke to a man named Louis Castillo. I explained my situation. He explained a bridge loan program that covered gaps up to $10,000 for qualifying non-traditional applicants. I enrolled on time. I did not tell my family about the bridge loan. I did not tell them about the $8,800 gap. I did not tell them I had nearly not made it. Some things, I had already learned, were only yours. Carver University School of Medicine was the hardest thing I have ever done, and I say that as someone who later completed a 3-year residency in internal medicine and a 2-year fellowship in hospital medicine. Medical school was the hardest because it was the foundation, and laying a foundation is always harder than building on one. Every examination in that first year felt like a conversation I had not yet learned the language of. Biochemistry, anatomy, physiology, I understood each of them individually. The integration, the way a single patient presentation could require you to hold a dozen physiological systems in mind simultaneously and rank them by urgency, was something I had to learn in pieces, like rebuilding a language from root words. What got me through the first year was a study group. 4 students who met every Tuesday and Thursday evening in a corner booth at a diner called the Caduceus on Franklin Avenue, 3 blocks from campus. The 4 of us were all non-traditional students, older than most of our cohort, returning from other careers, carrying the specific motivation of people who had chosen medicine the hard way. Their names were Marcus Tibbs, who had been a high school biology teacher in New Haven for 7 years. Yvonne Delacroix, who had been a registered nurse at Hartford Memorial for 9 years before deciding she wanted to be on the other side of the prescription pad. And a man named Roderick Santamaria, who had spent 4 years working with a family law attorney in Meriden, Connecticut, named Howard Chang of Chang and Associates, before deciding that the legal world was not where he belonged. We met every week for 3 years. When Marcus failed his Step 1 board exam on the first attempt, a 228, 2 points below passing, it was the four of us who met at the Caduceus on a Tuesday night and sat with him while he decided whether to continue. He continued. He passed on his second attempt with a 241. When I nearly withdrew from my second-year pharmacology course because I had a respiratory infection that lasted 6 weeks and left me so far behind I genuinely could not see how I would catch up, it was Yvonne who came to my apartment with 2 weeks of organized notes, printed and tabbed, and sat at my kitchen table while I worked through them. She stayed until 2 in the morning. She did not ask me to thank her. She just did it. My family during those 4 years was largely absent. Not aggressively absent, just quietly, consistently elsewhere. My father sent a card when I started and a card when I finished. Dorothea called on birthdays. My Aunt Margaret, I would learn later, had been doing something else entirely. Something that would change the shape of the next chapter of my life in ways I was not yet equipped to imagine. I graduated from Carver University School of Medicine in May of 2009. I was 35 years old. Dorothea called that evening. She said, "So you did it." I said yes. She said, "I am glad for you, Renata." She said it the way you say "I told you so" in reverse, with a careful neutrality that allowed her to avoid the word wrong. I held the phone and looked at the medical records organization system I had built on my desk, the folders, the reference cards, the color-coded binders I had used to manage my coursework, and I said thank you, and I meant it in a way that had nothing to do with her. I began my residency in internal medicine at Whitmore Memorial Hospital in July of 2009. My attending physician supervisor in the first year was a woman named Dr. Agatha Renner, who had been practicing internal medicine for 23 years, and who had, in my experience, the sharpest clinical intuition of anyone I have ever worked with. She could look at a patient from the door of the room, before any chart review, before a word was spoken, and tell you the 3 most likely diagnoses and the one you were most likely to miss. Dr. Renner did not compliment lightly. In my second month of residency, I presented a case in rounds, a 63-year-old patient with fatigue, mild shortness of breath, and peripheral edema that had been attributed to a venous insufficiency. And I argued, against the prevailing read in the room, that we were looking at a cardiac presentation that required a specialist appointment with the cardiology department rather than continued conservative management. I laid out my reasoning in 12 minutes. When I finished, Dr. Renner looked at me for a moment and then said, "Order the echo." The echocardiogram showed moderate left ventricular dysfunction. The patient was admitted to cardiac care that evening. After rounds, Dr. Renner found me in the hallway outside the nursing station and said 4 words. "You are going to be good at this." She walked away without waiting for a response. I stood in that hallway for a long time. I ran the medical records request myself for that patient's follow-up care rather than routing it through the standard administrative process, not out of procedure, but because I wanted to track the outcome. When the results came back confirming my diagnosis, I filed a copy in the professional portfolio I had been quietly building since my second year of medical school. Not out of ego, out of evidence. Because I had learned very early that in medicine, what you have documented is what you can defend. My residency ended in June of 2012. I was 38 years old. By that point, I had completed 312 inpatient cases across the internal medicine service. I had published a case report as second author in the Journal of Hospital Medicine with Dr. Renner. I had been selected as a resident teaching fellow for 1 semester, which meant I was the person the medical students called when they could not reach their attendings. I had received, on my final residency evaluation, the phrase exceptional clinical judgment and institutional potential in the section reserved for narrative assessment. I applied for a fellowship in hospital medicine at Carver University Hospital, the same Carver where I had gone to medical school, now considering me not as a student but as a physician in specialized training. The program director, a man named Dr. Jerome Wakefield, interviewed me in March of 2012. He asked me, at one point, where I saw myself in 15 years. I told him I wanted to run a department. I said it quietly, not as a boast but as a fact I had been carrying for a long time, and he wrote something on the pad in front of him and said, "Good answer." I completed my hospital medicine fellowship in June of 2014. I was 40 years old. I was licensed, board certified, and for the first time in my professional life, I held a position that matched the word I had been keeping in my wallet: physician. My Aunt Margaret called me on the evening I received my board certification results. I had not yet told my family I had taken the exam. She said, "I know what today is, I have been watching." I asked her how she had been watching. She said, "I have always been watching Renata." Then she told me something. She told me that in the autumn of 2003, the same autumn I had folded that paper and put it in my wallet, she had quietly begun setting aside money. Not in a savings account. In a trust, administered by an estate attorney named Clara Hoffmeister of the Hoffmeister Bellamy Law Group in Hartford, who had drafted the trust documents under Margaret's instruction with a single beneficiary clause. The trust could only be accessed to support my medical education, or, if I succeeded, to stabilize my early career. The trust had been funded incrementally, over the years, through Margaret's own retirement savings and the sale of a small investment property she owned in Fairfield County. By 2014, the trust held just over $400,000. I had not known, not a word of it. For 11 years, my aunt had been building a structure beneath my feet that I had no idea was there. I sat on the floor of my apartment kitchen and cried in a way I had not cried since the day my mother died. Because what Margaret had built was not just a financial arrangement, it was a testimony. It was a record, held in trust documents and signed in Clara Hoffmeister's office, that someone had believed in me from the beginning, before any result, before any title, before I had proven anything to anyone including myself. She had believed it first. She had one request. She asked me not to tell Dorothea. "Not yet," she said, "not until the right moment." She said, "Some things need to be protected until they are finished." I told her I understood. I told her I was still keeping her secret along with mine. I joined the faculty of Carver University Hospital's Department of Internal Medicine in September of 2014 as an attending physician. I was placed under the supervision of the department chair, Dr. Helena Marchetti Vance, who had been running the department for 11 years, and who had, in my estimation, the institutional trust of every person in that building. She gave me a panel of 42 patients in my first month. By the end of the third month, I had 61. By the end of the first year, I had a waiting list. The moment I knew I was in the right place happened on a Tuesday in February of 2016. I was reviewing a patient's insurance policy documentation, a middle-aged woman named Sylvia Osei, who had been denied coverage for a specialist appointment she urgently needed, on the grounds that the specialist was out of network. And I recognized, from the denial language in the insurance correspondence, that the insurer's justification was inconsistent with the policy's own health insurance coverage terms. I called the insurer's medical review line directly. I was on hold for 31 minutes. When a representative answered, I explained calmly the exact clause that contradicted their denial. I referenced the patient's medical records. I cited the specific policy provision number. The denial was overturned in that phone call. Sylvia Osei's daughter sent me a card 2 weeks later. It said, "You didn't have to fight that hard, thank you." I kept the card. I kept it in the same drawer where I had by then transferred the folded piece of paper from my wallet. My colleague and closest ally in the department, Dr. Tamaz Eguren, who had been in the department 4 years longer than I had and who knew more of my story than anyone except Margaret and Dr. Ichterberg, found me standing at my desk holding the card. He said, "You okay?" I said yes. He said, "That's the face you make when something matters." I said I supposed it was. In 2016, I was named Senior Attending Physician in the Department of Internal Medicine. In 2020, Dr. Marchetti Vance announced her retirement. In the spring of 2020, I was appointed department head. The morning of my appointment, I went to my office early, before anyone else arrived. I sat at the desk that had been Helena's for 11 years and was now mine. I looked at the room, the clean desk, the window facing the east wing of the hospital, the wall where I would eventually hang my board certification and my commendation plaques, and framed in the lower left corner, a piece of paper folded into quarters that had once lived in my wallet. I sat there in the quiet of 7:15 in the morning, and I did not say anything. I just sat in it. The weight and the silence and the 22 years of decisions that had brought me to this specific chair. I had called Margaret that evening. I told her. She said, "I know." She said it the way she always said things she had been waiting to say for a long time. She asked me again about Dorothea. I said, "Not yet." She said, "You will know when." I had come that close to everything surfacing before it was time. The previous autumn, I had run into one of Dorothea's colleagues at a medical conference, a man who worked in the benefits department of Dorothea's insurance firm, and who, apparently, knew her well enough to mention in passing that he had once heard her refer to a sister who had gone into medicine. He had looked at my name badge with an expression I could not quite read. I had excused myself before he could say anything further. I had gone back to my hotel room and stood at the window looking at the city and understood very clearly that the clock was running, that at some point someone was going to connect the name, that Dorothea was going to find out what I had become, and that when she did, I wanted to be the one standing in front of her. But it wasn't time yet. 3 months later, a referral came across my desk from a Dr. Anselm Wyrick of Millbrook Family Practice. The patient's name on the intake form was Dorothea Voskremer. I sat very still for approximately 40 seconds. Then I picked up my pen, initialed the form, and asked Priya to schedule the consultation. I already knew what day she would arrive. I already knew which corridor she would walk down. And I had already decided, with the calm that comes from having built something in silence for 22 years, exactly how I was going to walk out to meet her. Claude responded. She arrived on a Wednesday morning in March of 2025. She arrived on a Wednesday morning in March of 2025. I had been in my office since 6:45, reviewing the department's case load from the previous night's admissions. Priya had set the intake folder on the corner of my desk, as she always did, with the new consultation requests clipped to the front. Dorothea's was the third one in the stack. I had already read it twice the evening before. I read it a third time that morning anyway, because I wanted to be certain of every detail before she walked through the door. Her referring physician, Dr. Anselm Wyrick, had documented a 6-month history of progressive fatigue, unexplained weight loss, and intermittent abdominal discomfort. He had noted a family history of autoimmune disease, our mother, and had flagged the case as requiring a specialist appointment with internal medicine for a comprehensive evaluation. He had specifically requested a senior specialist. He had, without knowing it, sent her directly to me. I set the folder down. I looked at the window. Then I asked Priya, when she arrived at 8, to let me know when the patient checked in for the 9:30 consultation. Priya called my desk at 9:22. She said, "Dr. Voss, your 9:30 is in the lobby." She paused, which was unusual for Priya, who had worked with me for 6 years and was not given to pauses. Then she said, "Tomas at the front desk says she stopped at the directory wall. He says she looks like she might need a minute." I said, "Thank you, Priya." I stood up. I straightened my coat. I looked for one moment at the framed piece of paper in the lower left corner of my wall, folded into quarters, behind glass. The crease lines still visible from 22 years of living in a wallet, and then I walked out of my office and down the corridor toward the lobby. I heard her voice before I saw her. She was speaking to Tomas in a low, strained register, the way people speak when they are trying to appear composed and are not quite managing it. She was saying, I need to check whether there is a mistake on this directory. The name listed for department head, I know that name." And Tomas, who is 24 years old and was not equipped for whatever was in her voice, was saying, "Ma'am, there's no mistake. Dr. Voss has been department head since 2020. I came around the corner from the corridor into the lobby. Dorothea was standing with her back to me. She was wearing a gray coat I did not recognize, her dark hair now mostly silver, and she was gripping the strap of her bag with both hands. She was 60 years old, but in that moment, from behind, she looked smaller than I had ever seen her look. She looked like a person who had just been handed a fact she had no place to put. I said, "Dorothea." She turned around. I have thought about that moment more than I can calculate. I have turned it in my mind the way you turn something in your hands to find where the weight is. What I remember is that she looked at me, at my face, at my coat, at the badge on my chest that read Dr. Renata Voss, Department Head, Internal Medicine, and her face did not go through the emotions in the order I would have predicted. She did not look shocked first. She looked for one long moment, as though she had swallowed something that was too large and too solid and she did not know what to do with it. Then she said, "Renata." I said, "Good morning, come with me." I turned and walked back toward my department, and after a moment I heard her footsteps behind me. I had not known before that morning what I would feel when I saw her. I had imagined versions of it for years, not fantasies of revenge, but practical anticipations, the way you anticipate a difficult conversation by running the likely variables. What I had not anticipated was the particular quality of the quiet I felt as I walked back down that corridor with my sister following me. It was not triumph. It was not relief. It was something closer to gravity, the specific heaviness of a thing arriving exactly when and how it was always going to arrive. The situation was more layered than a simple family reckoning. Dorothea had come to my hospital because she was sick, and I was the physician she had been referred to, and whatever had passed between us 22 years ago, that fact remained. I would do my job. I would do it completely and without compromise, because that was who I had built myself to be. But before the clinical work began, there was something else that needed to happen. There was a conversation that had been waiting for 22 years, and it was waiting in a manila folder in my desk drawer, and Clara Hoffmeister's name was on the documents inside it. I had called Clara Hoffmeister 3 months earlier, the evening after the referral from Dr. Wyrick came across my desk. I had called her on my cell phone, standing at my kitchen window, and I had said, "I think it's time." She had said, "I've been ready for 4 years." I signed the first document that night, electronically, with a timestamp of 11:47 in the evening. There was no going back. What I had gathered, in the 3 months between that phone call and Dorothea's arrival, was substantial. The trust that Margaret had established in 2003, administered by Clara Hoffmeister, documented in trust documents that had been revised and updated 9 times over the intervening years, had grown significantly. Margaret had continued to fund it until her death in the autumn of 2022, when she passed away from a stroke at the age of 81. In her will, which Clara had also drafted, Margaret left the trust's administration and final distribution terms to me. She left a letter as well, in a sealed envelope that Clara had held for 7 years, which I had read the night of Margaret's death, and which I have never shared with anyone except Tomas Eguren, who sat on my couch while I read it and did not ask what it said. Margaret's will also contained a provision that none of the family, not my father, not Dorothea, had been aware of. She had held an investment property in Fairfield County, a 2-unit rental building she had purchased in 1989. She had updated the will in 2018 to leave that property to me directly. The property, by the time of her death, had an equity value of approximately $310,000. This had not been disclosed to the family during the estate process because Dorothea, who had appointed herself the informal manager of the family's estate affairs after our father's decline into dementia in 2019, had never known the property existed. Margaret had owned it under a family limited liability structure that had not been visible in her general financial disclosures. When Dorothea discovered, 6 months after Margaret's death, that there was an asset she had not known about, she hired an estate attorney. His name was Bradley Fenn of Fenn and Callaway in Glastonbury, Connecticut. He sent a letter to Clara Hoffmeister's firm in February of 2023, asserting that the property distribution may have been improper and requesting a review of the full financial disclosure record from the estate. Clara had called me the same afternoon that letter arrived. She said, "This is what I anticipated." She said it calmly, the way she said everything, with the specific evenness of someone who has been practicing estate law for 31 years and has seen this particular move in many different forms. She said, "They don't have grounds, Renata. The LLC structure is completely clean. The property was Margaret's to dispose of as she chose, but they may push on this for a while." She was right. Bradley Fenn pushed for 18 months. He filed a formal claim of improper asset concealment against the estate in April of 2023. It was not a strong claim. Clara had told me from the beginning that it was unlikely to succeed, but it was a real claim, with real paperwork, and Dorothea had signed her name to the complaint, which meant that at some point I would have to formally respond. I had not responded through my attorney until I was ready. Clara had advised me that we could move slowly, because time was on our side and the claim was thin. I had agreed. I had used those 18 months to gather everything I needed. I reviewed the trust documents myself, all 11 revised versions, over 3 evenings in January of 2025. I am not an estate attorney, but I understand documentation at a level that most physicians do not, because I have spent 22 years reading and filing medical records, insurance policy language, financial disclosures, and institutional reports. I read those documents the way I read a complex patient chart, looking for the logic structure, for the internal consistency, for anything that could be challenged, and whether the challenge would hold. Nothing would hold. Clara had built that trust with the precision of someone who expected it to be contested. I brought Tamaz into it in February of 2025. I told him the full story, the trust, the property, Dorothea's complaint, the timeline. He sat in the chair across from my desk and listened without interrupting for approximately 20 minutes. When I finished, he said, "So what do you need from me?" I said, "I need you to cover my panel on March 12th. There's a meeting that morning I cannot reschedule." He said, "Done." He stood up and then he paused at the door and turned around and said, "Renata, you know you could have told me any of this at any point in the last 10 years. I said I knew. He said, "Okay." He left. That was the moment I understood exactly how much they had underestimated the people I had chosen to keep close. 2 days before Dorothea's scheduled consultation at my hospital, I received a phone call from my father's care facility, the Elmwood Memory Care Center in West Hartford, where he had been a resident since 2021. The caller was his primary care coordinator, a woman named Judith Alarkin, who called me periodically to update me on his condition. She said he had had a quiet week. She said he had been asking, in the confused and indirect way of someone in late-stage dementia, for his sister Margaret. She said he did not seem to remember that Margaret was gone. I thanked Judith. I sat with the phone in my hand for a moment after the call ended. My father, who had nodded when Dorothea told me I was not built for medicine, was now in a memory care facility, tended to by a coordinated team of specialists. His medical expenses, managed through a health insurance coverage plan, I had helped Dorothea navigate in 2021, when she had not known which policy to choose. She had called me for advice on that, the insurance policy terms, and I had given it to her, carefully and completely, because he was my father and because being able to help him was the point. She had not asked, then, what I did for work. She had assumed I was in a general practice somewhere. I had let her assume it. Priya had already documented the care coordination note in my calendar when I checked it that evening. Clara Hoffmeister's name was flagged for a call the following morning. Everything was in its place. Dorothea had proposed, in a phone call 2 weeks before her scheduled consultation, that we meet for dinner before her appointment. She said she thought it would be easier to talk in person. I said I agreed and suggested a restaurant close to the hospital, a quiet Italian place called Benedetti's on Charter Street, where I had eaten many times, and where the corner booth in the back had, for years, been the place I went when I needed to think through something difficult. She arrived at Benedetti's 12 minutes late, in the same gray coat. She sat across from me and ordered sparkling water, and looked at the menu longer than someone who intended to order anything would look at a menu. Then she said, "I want to talk about Aunt Margaret's estate." I said, "All right." She said, "There is an asset that we were not informed about during the estate process. A property. Bradley, my attorney, says there are legitimate questions about whether the distribution was handled correctly." She said it carefully, with the same tone she had always used when she believed she was delivering an unpleasant fact with appropriate consideration. She said, "I am not trying to make this adversarial, Renata, but the financial disclosure from the estate didn't include the property, and that is a problem." I said, "I understand your concern." She said, "Bradley thinks we have a real claim here, he's been very clear about that." She looked at me steadily. "I just want things to be handled fairly." Margaret loved both of us. I kept my hands flat on the table. I looked at the candle between us, then back at her and said, "You're right that she did." She said, "So we're in agreement that this should be reviewed." I said, "I have already spoken with Clara Hoffmeister. We will address everything that needs to be addressed." I picked up my water glass. "But I want to hear how you're feeling. You came to the hospital today for a reason that has nothing to do with estate questions, and I want to make sure we are not losing track of that." She blinked. The shift caught her. She had been prepared for the estate conversation and not for me to redirect toward her health. She said, "I'm fine, it's just fatigue." I said, "Yvonne Delacroix, one of my colleagues, will be your attending physician for the clinical evaluation. She's exceptional. You're in the right place." Dorothea looked at me for a long moment. She said, "You're really a department head." I said, "Yes." She looked at the table. She said, I want you to know I didn't mean." I said, "Let's focus on your health first. We can talk about the rest." She nodded. She thought she had won the estate conversation by keeping it civil and measured. She had 2 more days before she understood what she was actually facing. And the meeting Clara Hofmeister had arranged for March 12th was already confirmed. Tomas had already spoken with the Carver University Hospital legal office the day before, as I had asked him to confirm the institutional standing of the trust documentation in the context of any professional matters that might intersect with my department. The answer had been exactly what I had expected it to be. The meeting on March 12th was not at the hospital. It was at Clara Hofmeister's office on the 14th floor of the Rennick Building on Asylum Avenue in Hartford, a space that managed, despite its corporate precision, to feel like a library. Dark wood, organized shelves, the smell of paper and certainty. Clara had arranged a round conference table, which I had specifically requested, because round tables distribute authority evenly and I wanted no one at the head. Present at that table, Clara Hofmeister, estate attorney, Hofmeister Bellamy Law Group. Tomas Eguren, who had taken the morning off and arrived in a gray suit I had never seen him wear before. Roderick Santamaria, who had, in the 20 years since our medical school study group at the Caduceus, completed his medical degree, practiced as a hospitalist for 6 years, and then returned to law to specialize in medical legal consultation at a firm called Santamaria and Reed, a combination that made him exactly the kind of person you wanted in a room where medicine and estate law were about to intersect. Dorothea Bradley Fenn. And representing a reviewing function at Carver University Hospital's Administrative Affairs Office, a woman named Dr. Irene Chakravorty, who was the hospital's Associate Vice President of Medical Affairs, and who had no personal stake in the outcome, but whose institutional presence confirmed the professional dimensions of what was being addressed. I arrived last, because I had been in a patient consultation until 8:55, and because arriving last was not a power move. It was simply what happened when you ran a department and your work did not pause for personal matters. Priya had ordered a car. I walked in at 9:03, apologized to the room for the brief delay, set my bag on the floor beside my chair, and sat down. Bradley Fenn was a tall man in his 50s with the particular posture of someone who spent a great deal of time at conference tables and had learned to fill space with it. He had a yellow legal pad in front of him, and he had already arranged his documents in 3 neat stacks. He looked at me when I sat down with the expression of someone who had been told this meeting would be straightforward. Clara said, "Thank you all for being here. We are addressing the formal claim filed by Ms. Vosskremer in April of 2023 regarding the distribution of an asset from the estate of Margaret Irene Voss, deceased. I will walk through the documentation in sequence. Please hold questions until I have completed the overview." She opened the first folder. The first document was the original trust instrument, dated October 14, 2003. Clara placed a copy in front of each person at the table. She said, "The Margaret Irene Voss Educational and Professional Trust was established in October of 2003 by the grantor, Margaret Voss, for the benefit of a single named beneficiary. The trust was funded incrementally over a period of 19 years through contributions from the grantor's personal retirement savings and from the proceeds of a single investment property held under the grantor's sole ownership." She paused. The trust's existence was known to the grantor, to the beneficiary, and to this office. It was not required to be disclosed during the estate process because it was a living trust, not a probate asset. It passed outside of probate entirely as it was designed to do. Bradley Fenn said, "With respect, the property that funded the trust was not disclosed in the financial." Clara said, "Mr. Fenn, I have not yet finished the overview." He stopped. "That was the first document. I had 3 more. The second document was the 2018 will revision, the amendment that had transferred the Fairfield County property directly to me." Clara placed copies. She walked through the execution record, the date, the 2 independent witnesses, the notarization. She said, "The property was a non-probate asset at the time of the decedent's death, as it had been transferred into the trust structure in 2018 by means of a valid deed transfer, fully recorded with the Fairfield County Land Records Office." She produced a copy of the recorded deed. The recording date is visible here. The financial disclosure provided during probate accurately reflected all probate assets. This property was not a probate asset. Bradley Fenn looked at his legal pad. He wrote something. His pen moved more slowly than it had a moment before. The third document was the full trust distribution record, every contribution, every investment return, every administrative action taken in the trust's 19-year history, audited annually by Gerald Okonkwo of Stratford Wealth Partners, whose certification letters were attached as an appendix. Clara walked through the audit trail page by page. She did not hurry. She said, the trust's value at the time of the grantor's death was $412,000, including investment returns. The trust was distributed to the named beneficiary in full within 60 days of the grantor's death, consistent with the trust instrument's distribution terms. Dorothea had not spoken since the meeting began. She was sitting very still, both hands on the table in front of her, looking at the documents. She had read the trust instrument's first page, and I had watched her read it, and I had watched the moment she reached the establishment date, October of 2003, and understood what that date meant. Her face did not change dramatically. She did not gasp. But I saw her hands go still on the table, very still, the specific stillness of a person who has just felt the ground shift and is trying not to show it. She looked up from the document and looked at me. I looked back at her steadily. She said, she started this in 2003. I said, yes. She said, the same year. She stopped. I said, yes. There was a silence at the table. Even Bradley Fenn did not fill it. Dr. Irene Chakravorty, who had been listening with the specific attention of someone who was present as a witness, and intended to remain precisely that, shifted slightly in her chair. She said in her measured institutional voice, for the record, Dr. Voss, could you confirm your current position at Carver University Hospital? I said, Department Head of Internal Medicine. I have held the position since April of 2020. Dr. Chakravorty nodded and wrote something on her notepad. The note, I understood, was for the institutional record. It confirmed, in a formal and documented way, that the beneficiary of Margaret's trust was a senior institutional figure with 22 years of verifiable professional history, not a speculative beneficiary, not a disputed heir, but a physician with a file as thick as any document on that table. Clara placed the fourth document. It was a letter, handwritten on plain stationery, dated September 18, 2003, 4 days after the Sunday dinner where Dorothea had told me I would never survive medical training. The letter was in Margaret's handwriting, addressed to Clara Hofmeister, and it was the founding instruction letter that had accompanied the original trust instrument. Clara had preserved it in the trust file for 22 years. It was not a legal document in the strict sense. It had no binding force, but Clara had included it, she told the room, because she believed the grantor's intention should be on record. She read one line from it aloud. She said, the grantor writes, I am doing this because I watched my niece tonight and I saw someone who is going to build something remarkable, and I do not want anyone to be able to take it from her. Not the money, not the possibility, not the time. Was all Clara read. She closed the letter and set it back in the folder. At the far end of the table, Bradley Fenn put down his pen. Dorothea said, and her voice for the first time in my memory had a quality I could not categorize as anything except small. She said, she never told me. I said, no. She said, she was doing this the whole time and she never said anything. I said, she asked me to protect it until it was finished. Dorothea looked at the table for a long time. She looked at the trust instrument's first page again. She looked at the date. She looked at her hands. Then she said, I told you that you wouldn't survive. She said it quietly, not as a memory but as a confession. The way people say things when they have finally run out of the position that allowed them to avoid saying them. I said, yes, you did. She said, I was wrong. There were 8 other people in the room. None of them spoke. I looked at my sister, at the silver in her hair, at the gray coat, at the hands still flat on the table, and I felt something release in my chest that I had been holding for so long I had stopped noticing its weight. It was not victory. It was not vindication. It was something quieter than both of those words. It was the specific feeling of a door that has been closed for a very long time finally, completely, clicking shut. Bradley Fenn spoke carefully. He said, in light of the documentation presented today, I would advise my client to withdraw the claim. He looked at Dorothea. She nodded once without looking up. Clara said, we will prepare the withdrawal paperwork. I will send it to your office by end of week. The meeting concluded at 11:17. It had lasted 2 hours and 14 minutes. I thanked Dr. Chakravorty for her time. I shook Bradley Fenn's hand briefly and without hostility. He was a man doing his job and the job was over. I embraced Tamaz, who put one hand briefly on my shoulder and said, Margaret would have liked this room. I said I thought so too. Roderick Santamaria waited until most people had filed out, then came and stood beside me and said, I have been waiting to see this for a long time. He said it with a careful formality that I recognized as his way of expressing deep feeling without making either of us uncomfortable. Dorothea was the last one in the room besides me. She was standing by the window, looking at the city below. She had her bag in one hand and the trust document in the other. Clara had offered her a copy and she had taken it without seeming to decide to. I walked to the window and stood beside her. Below us, Hartford was going about its Wednesday in March, cars, pedestrians, a food cart on the corner, ordinary life at ordinary speed. She said, "How long have you been the department head?" I said, "4 years." She said, "How long have you been at Carver?" I said, 11 years as attending. 2 years of fellowship before that. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "I should have called you more." I said, "Yes." She said, "I'm sorry, Renata." She said it the way she said most things, carefully, as though she had considered the sentence before speaking it, but this time the care felt different. It felt like it was costing her something. I said, "I know." We stood at the window a while longer. Neither of us said anything. Below us, the food cart moved a few feet to the left, repositioning for the lunch crowd. The formal withdrawal of Dorothea's estate claim was filed with the court on March 18th. The court order confirming the withdrawal was issued on March 24th. Clara Hoffmeister's office sent me a copy, which I filed in the same drawer where I kept Sylvia Osai's card and the folded piece of paper. Dorothea's clinical evaluation with Yvonne Delacroix was completed in the weeks following. The findings were serious but treatable, an autoimmune thyroid condition that had been progressing undetected for several years, requiring regular specialist appointments with endocrinology and an ongoing medication regimen. Her health insurance coverage through her employer's policy covered the majority of her treatment costs. I reviewed her case file at Yvonne's request, because Yvonne knew enough of the history to want a second set of eyes, and I approved the care plan without reservation. Dorothea is currently in treatment. Her prognosis at this point is good. My father remains at Elmwood Memory Care. He does not recognize me consistently anymore. When I visit, which I do every 3 weeks, he sometimes looks at me with a particular expression, the shadow of a recognition that does not quite surface, and I sit with him and talk about things that do not require him to remember anything in particular. I tell him about the hospital. I tell him about the view from my office. Sometimes he listens with what seems like interest. Sometimes he does not. I go anyway. Tomas Eguren was promoted, in January of 2026, to medical director of the hospital's Integrated Care Division. I attended his appointment ceremony and shook his hand in front of 36 colleagues and told him, privately afterward, that I would not be sending him good cases from my department just because he had a new title. He laughed and said he would settle for the bad ones. Dr. Simonich Terberg, my therapist, has been with me through 14 years of this story. When I told her how the March 12th meeting ended, she said, "How do you feel?" I thought about it for a moment. I said, "Finished." She said, "Is that good?" I said, "Yes, I think finished is exactly right." I still have the piece of paper. It lives in a frame now, behind glass, in the lower left corner of my office wall. The fold lines have faded a little, but you can still read what is written on it if you know what you are looking at. The name of the Hartley Pre-Medical Program, the name of an MCAT prep course, the name of a student loan officer. The paper is not there to remind me of what was done to me. It is there to remind me of what I decided to do instead. I think about Margaret often. I think about a woman who watched a dinner table where someone was being quietly dismantled, who went home and called an estate attorney, who built a structure of protection around someone who did not yet know they needed it, and who kept the secret for 19 years without ever asking for recognition. That is the kind of faith that does not announce itself. It just builds and waits and holds. I have not told Dorothea about the letter. The original is still in Clara Hoffmeister's file. Maybe one day I will give it to her. Maybe she needs to spend a little more time without it first. I have not decided. There is no urgency. Some things can wait until the moment is right, and I have learned, over 22 years, to be patient with that kind of timing. And if there's anything this experience taught me, it's this. 1. What you build in silence cannot be taken from you by the people who refuse to believe in it, because they never knew it existed until it was already finished. 2. Documentation is not bureaucracy. It is the language through which truth becomes undeniable, and every record you keep is a sentence in a story that will eventually be read aloud in a room where it matters. 3. You are not defined by the family that failed to see you. You are defined by what you chose to become in the years they were not watching. Was I wrong to keep everything silent for 22 years, to let my family believe whatever they needed to believe rather than defend myself to people who had already decided? Tell me in the comments. If this story gave you strength, hit that like button. It means more than you know.